Hi, welcome to our discussion of the fourth fallacy, which is the genetic fallacy. As you might guess, the word genetic is related to a word that has to do with origins. You might know that Genesis is the first book of the Bible, and Genesis means beginning. The Greek word Genesis means beginning. So where does something come from? What its origin is what's in view. When we think of the genetic fallacy, it makes me think of genes. And genetics, the origin of your eye color and your hair color and so forth have to do with your genes. So we're going to be talking about fallacies that focus on the origin of ideas. And just because you can point out that a particular idea, a particular point that's being proposed, comes from a certain source, doesn't mean that you can discredit it. For example, let's say that my dad loves gardening, and I grow up in my family, which you would expect. It seems normal. My family moved around a lot, but I always managed to find them again. That's a joke. At any rate, so let's say my dad was an avid gardener. Every weekend he's gardening, and he is a connoisseur of gardening, and he buys really good gardening tools. In fact, he begins to show me by example and by instruction that if you buy the very best tools, if you're a gardener, in the long run it's going to save you money and save you a lot of headache, because you won't have to replace that shovel or that rake or that hoe or that trowel or what have you spade over time. They will last. So I'm making an argument that you need to buy the very best gardening tools if you're a serious gardener. Spend more money up front and buy the best thing. And Ellen may dismiss that argument and say, well, you're just advocating that, proposing that because your dad tells you need to do that. You've been socialized into expensive gardening tools by your family. Dismiss it. You're only proposing it because of the influence of your father upon you. Well, is that a fallacy?
Yes.
It is. It is a fallacy. Why? Why, Grace?
It's attacking the source of the argument rather than the argument itself. It's saying that the only reason that idea is true is because that idea came from a source where it was true.
So just because you've been raised in a certain family and you end up, of course your family is going to influence you. You come up with certain ideas, certain ways of doing things, certain beliefs and actions. Does that mean that you only have reason to believe and do those things because of the influence of your family? No. There can actually be a good reason for this. But let's hear the argument, right? Let's hear the argument. What is the argument for buying expensive gardening tools? Rather than just saying, well, you got that argument from X, so therefore it can't really be a good argument. Of course, you can get a bad argument from X. You can get a bad argument from your family upbringing, or a good one. But let's hear the argument. What might be some other examples? So you think of this. Well, before we go there, let me just read the definition. I think we've kind of summarized it, but here's the definition in the book for the genetic fallacy. An argument which states that an idea should be discounted simply because of its source or origin. So any of the rest of you, what might be an argument, an example of this fallacy where we would discount an argument simply because of its source or origin?
Can we bring up real quickly again, the distinguishing characteristics between the ad hominem abusive, the ad hominem circumstantial, and the genetic fallacy once again? What would be the difference? Because these are all going to be from the source. It's part of the ad fontem arguments again. So this one is going to be very similar to the ad hominem circumstantial fallacy, and the distinguishing features between them is going to be, it's going to be subtle and sometimes a little blurred, and perhaps some overlap between them. So there may be occasions where it's a little bit of both. How would you describe the difference between the ad hominem circumstantial and the genetic fallacy? Before we give some examples.
For the most part, ad hominem abusive fallacies are personal attacks involving insults. Ad hominem circumstantial fallacies are personal attacks involving circumstances, and genetic fallacies are impersonal attacks, meaning they apply to ideas or products.
Excellent. So that's, the distinction between the personal and the impersonal thing is a good one to grasp. the argument I gave about the gardening, you might say, well, it can become personal because it's my family, but it's really, you wouldn't be criticizing me personally. You're just saying, oh, there's this source outside of me as a person that's responsible. And I might get my ideas from the American Gardening Association, and I might be quoting their literature and saying, oh, well, the American Gardening Association suggests that you buy, stainless steel spades and so forth. And you might say, oh, another AGA argument. You're just reading the talking points off from the AGA, American Gardening Association website again. I'm not going to listen to that. Have you ever heard about talking points? That sometimes people, the radio critics, political critics, and talk show hosts will say, well, no, that's just the talking host from the Democratic committee, or, these candidates are spouting off the talking points from the Republican, National Committee and so forth. And therefore they can be discredited because they're obviously, that's not an argument here. Now, so what if when a political party did actually publish some talking points and send out some memos and faxes to all of their political activists and say, here's what we want to be saying about, say, the new spending bill, and sure enough, various political activists and candidates start making some of the same points because they've gotten this memo. Should we dismiss that? Should we dismiss those? Why not? Why shouldn't we? Why should we not dismiss them following talking points and making their arguments?
Because we should be judging the arguments based on their intrinsic value, based on their crediting them standing alone. Because rather than just for the Republican Party, that even if it is from the party and even if they're citing word for word, direct words from the memo, that doesn't mean that the logic of what they're saying is in some way invalid. So,
well, let's get back to Jolie's point, though. I know I'm famous for getting off point myself, and that can be my own kind of fallacious way. But the difference between the ad hominem circumstantial fallacy and the genetic fallacy, how are they different?
Well, and those two are the two that usually get confused most easily, because when we're talking about the circumstances surrounding someone, that can seem to be the basis for where they're getting their argument, and so it can be hard to distinguish whether or not it's the argument where the genesis of the argument is coming from or the circumstances surrounding the individual. And it's sometimes those two ideas are hard to distinguish. So in your example with the gardening tools, for example, are we discrediting you because of the circumstances of your situation, that you were born into a gardening family and that's your circumstance, so we're discrediting you? Or are we discrediting the origin of where you're getting your ideas from, that you lived with a professional gardener, and this professional gardener had specific ways that he did things and specific ideas about how he taught you to garden, and it's those ideas that you were raised with that we're discrediting as being not necessarily the best way to do things. So is it your familial circumstance, or is it the origin of the arguments that you've been raised around that we're dismissing? And that's a very subtle distinction, but one is an ad hominem circumstantial argument, and one is a genetic fallacy argument. And that's where we have to be looking for that, to really splice out, which it is. And it's a hard distinction to make, and you'd really have to sit and think about it for a long time. And someone might actually be trying to do both. They might be trying to discredit you and your circumstances and the origin of the arguments. And so we could say that it's really both fallacies that are being committed. And let's face it, sometimes when people come up with an argument like that, they haven't really categorized it in their mind anyway. They haven't decided, I am making a specifically genetic fallacy right here. And so the only way that I'm going to the only way they're going to get out of this is if they label this correctly. They have to label it as a genetic fallacy, because if they label it as an ad hominem circumstantial fallacy, they're wrong. They haven't labeled the right fallacy. I've done that much pre-thinking about this. Most people don't think that way anyway. So when it comes down to something like that, your teacher, or you're right if you've gotten on to the point that it's an ad phontem argument, and you're super close if you've gotten to it's an ad hominem circumstantial or that it's a genetic fallacy, and you could probably go about figuring out the fallacy in it and getting back to the real issue, even if you haven't pinpointed it precisely, down to between the nitty-gritty of those two. So it's important that you've done the thinking to get there and not to get hung up on it too much. But we're going to try to keep our fallacies today on this lesson on the genetic fallacies, so we can give some good examples of those.
So let's try and do that. Thank you. That was a great explication. What might be an example of something that perhaps, maybe if you look at your own biography, your own life, that where you know that you hold to certain kinds of views that you would argue for, that you have derived from some other source, from a clear source. Obviously, there's your family, but there may be some other sources that have given you certain ideals for behavior and action and belief.
Soccer is the best sport in the world.
Soccer is the best sport in the world. And the source of that argument would be?
Well, my dad and me actually going overseas for a time and playing it with, really professionally. Not professionally, but...
Superb soccer players, highest level of soccer play.
Well, at the age I was playing.
I see, the age of 4.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Okay, so you might actually have an argument, even though, and I'd be interested to hear at some point, what are the arguments why soccer is the best sport in the world, but you've derived that from some of your travels overseas. Okay, any other examples? How about, if not your own life, examples outside of your life? Can you call up some examples where people believe in a particular course of action or way of being that's been derived from some clear source?
Well, conservative, from my own personal experience, been raised in a conservative family with conservative beliefs about from everything from eating to media to religious beliefs. So I'm naturally conservative to some extent, and I can admit that is on account of my family and the genetic. Not that I think there is clear reasoning for it.
Why don't you give us an example in the eating realm?
Yeah, in the eating realm. Oh, well, there are dozens. Well, no MSG as a principle would be something from...
Mainly your mother.
My mother, mainly, yes, I suppose. That's a belief that my mother caused me to adopt, mainly through experience and rules, I suppose.
Now, and so and I happen to know that your mother, my wife, also has a mother, your grandmother, who also has similar views. So they seem to have been passed down. But was that relevant to why you would argue for no MSG?
No.
Not ultimately. You need to look at, let's hear the argument for MSG or no MSG, regardless of whether it's been drummed into you by your health conscious mother. Okay, other ideas. Now let's just, why don't we tease up a few organizations that people tend to use as sources for their beliefs and thoughts. What are some common organizations, common sources of beliefs?
Sometimes a lot of environmentally conscious companies will promote their products by saying they're made in America or they're made locally. And that's kind of a genetic fallacy of sorts because they're promoting the source of their product rather than the product itself. For all we know, products in Europe could be better.
Very good. Very common. You see commercials to this effect, right? Buy American. And there may be some good reasons for buying American, but let's hear them.
Okay.
Any other ideas coming to mind? Seth?
We went to the farm show. There's something linked to Grace. Farm show in Pennsylvania is just a big, practically state fair in a building in the middle of winter in Pennsylvania where all these vendors come. and we went down to the shopping area to look at the food that they're selling, and we walked by a honey stand, and on a lot of the bottles it said just "Made in America," and I thought to myself, what exactly does that prove? Why exactly does that make that better? And I could see why they would use it, but I thought to myself, it doesn't exactly make the honey better. So,
Again, a very good example. And there's a lot that's not being said, right? Just a simple phrase, "Made in America." Boy, in a conversation, maybe there would be some more discussion about what that means and why it would be important, but the simple phrase "Made in America" is kind of lacking. You have to kind of fill in connect a lot of dots there to know what it might be arguing for.
I had a similar circumstance with Seth. It also involves honey. Bought some honey that was honey from Africa, which I'm very much in support of supporting Africans and supporting African honey. However, this honey was it was bitter. It was dark, it was grainy, it was bitter. So, it may have been from Africa and it may have been for the sake of a good cause, but the honey as itself, as a product, just because it comes from Africa doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to be the right kind of honey to buy. It may be, we may buy it not because we want a good honey, but because for the sake of supporting Africa.
Correct. Someone might say, here's my argument. Buy bitter, bad-tasting honey from Africa to support these African beekeepers and so forth and help the African economy. And that might be a good argument. Probably wouldn't characterize it quite as bad-tasting, but, bitter. But if the argument is, this is great honey, you ought to buy it, and it's from Africa, that would be introducing an irrelevancy if the argument's for buying good honey. Well, Jolie, would you like to suggest any other examples from ways in which people use outside sources for their arguments and then find themselves discredited for doing so?
I'm thinking maybe of Ellen's example. Maybe we could talk about that one a little bit. What was the example that you had?
I said, Nathaniel in the Bible said, "Can anything good come out of Galilee?" when referring to Jesus.
Right. The discussion we had been having about that particular fallacy was whether or not that fallacy was an example of a genetic fallacy or of an ad hominem circumstantial fallacy. And we were talking about, in some of our previous tapings here, we've talked about the fact that we live in the Harrisburg area, and there's an east shore and a west shore to the river here, and that there aren't really any defining characteristic. I shouldn't say there aren't any, but there are a few really defining characteristics about either shore that would make the West Shore, people on the West Shore believe or behave or think about government, social norms, that sort of thing, any differently than people who live on the East Shore. So in that circumstance, when we were talking before, we had used the East Shore, West Shore example as an ad hominem circumstantial fallacy, sort of, because it really would involve just the one specific individual about where they happen to live, and not so much about any cultural differences on either shore. When we talk about something like Galilee, for example, we could almost be talking about any place in the Middle East which have defining characteristics. People born and raised in Saudi Arabia, for example, are going to have Islamic ideas as the foundation for what they believe, their cultural, their religious, their economic beliefs. So how they treat women, how men are regarded in society, their ideas about marriage, all sorts of things become wrapped up into where these people are from and what ideas and beliefs that they hold. Similarly with Galilee being, a part of a Jewish country at the time, and your example is from as a biblical reference, New Testament biblical reference. And there's going to be inherent ideas and cultural norms and that sort of thing inherent within the example you gave. So sometimes we have to think about it might be naive to dismiss an example like one that has to do with Islam or Judaism or Hinduism or Buddhism or those sorts of things as being circumstantial fallacies, because there's something really deep and different and and thoughtful about the undercurrent, the origin of ideas that those people believe in, that would make where someone is from a genetic fallacy. To discuss the area where they're from would be a genetic fallacy, not just an ad hominem circumstantial fallacy. If that makes does that make sense? How I describe that? Okay.
A great example. That's the place in the New Testament where someone is hearing that about Christ and saying, and hears that Christ is from Galilee or Nazareth, which is in Galilee, and says, well, can anything good come out of Galilee? So sometimes the place that you are from is no more than just a place. It's a source of ideas. And so in that case, we have a blending of the ad hominem circumstantial and this particular genetic fallacy. Well, we'll let that rest our discussion of the genetic fallacy. I'm sure you'll tease up a number of examples yourself, and then we'll be coming back next, I think, for our discussion of the straw man fallacy. We'll see you then.